Hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Tales podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dan Barker, who runs an organization called Halcyon based out of Washington. And when you hear the story about Halcyon, the background, it's an incubator for social impact businesses. And it's an interesting one to go through, because for me, the learnings that we get from working with incubators is huge. But then to put an impact focus on it and say, so how do we operate with different businesses to get the funding, the growth, the governance, and the leadership into there, and how do we build those types of organizations? Then some of the stories and some of the information you get from Dan today is powerful in there. I'm so keen for you to hear this, and so keen to hear what you think about this, but I'm desperate to get in myself and see Halcyon at some point. So enjoy today's episode. Hey, Dan. So Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great to have you on. For the listeners, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, dig into your past history, tell us a bit about how you got here.
Sure, yeah. So I serve as managing director at Halcyon. We're an incubator and investor in early stage impact-driven companies from across the globe. And our goal is to make impact really the future of business, and having impact at the core of how business functions, really the reality for our future, because we know that's what's needed to make us more prosperous, more equitable, more sustainable moving forward. I got here through kind of a roundabout way. I actually started my career as a researcher focused on international development and global health. Then I moved on to, from the world of ideas. I had the chance to work with really smart people who had the best ideas, honestly. But in my experience, many cases, PhDs really undervalue what it takes to make those ideas happen in the real world. But I saw some of those failings in real time. Wanted to think about where I could go to get some of those strategy skills, things about like, how do you actually get this brilliant idea and see it realized in the real world. I went to grad school and decided to go to the consulting route. It was a skill set that I thought would be valuable. And that's actually links very neatly back to how I ended up at Halcyon. Quickly realized within consulting that I had actually a very limited attention span for things that I was not interested in.
Join the club.
I was lucky enough, after a first kind of slog of a project, which was not terribly interesting to me, to be able to navigate towards more social impact projects, which was fantastic. And one of those projects was actually running a pro bono engagement between Deloitte and Halcyon. And so actually was able to run that. And that was my first exposure to Halcyon, and was really thrilled by that. And after 3 or 4 years at Deloitte, wanted to think about how I could do this kind of intersection of the private sector and social impact full time. And so moved into the world of corporate social responsibility, first at BlackRock and then at MasterCard. And at MasterCard, I really got to sink my teeth into kind of another full circle moment. I was responsible for supporting research that focused on financial inclusion, economic inclusion, future of work, and how we could translate that kind of research into actionable insights that could influence folks who are actually building. So whether that was folks at MasterCard or others building technologies and solutions to, again, with the full focus on economic and financial inclusion. And after several years of kind of testing the big corporate model of social impact, decided that I wanted to go back to the startup ecosystem. And Halcyon actually wasn't on my radar, but through a chance lunch and conversation, actually trying to recruit somebody to a nonprofit board that I'm on, ended up actually back here in this seat, and really excited to lead our programs here at Halcyon.
Amazing. No, I love it. There's so much I could dig into there, but I want to go back to a previous conversation we had, because your family influences were large in there as well. So a degree of fighting the family influences and going your own path. Yeah.
I almost say that it's almost in my DNA, somewhat, so to speak. I was born to Guyanese immigrants in New York City. My mom was and is a social worker, a licensed certified clinical social worker. I grew up seeing her engage with her clients. She worked mostly in nonprofits focused on supporting the formerly homeless, mentally ill, mentally disabled with supportive housing. So running residential programs. For the first part of my life, being a single parent meant that I spent actually a lot of time in some of these residential facilities, which I think is fairly unique for a 6-year-old to be in that kind of environment. But just seeing the care and sort of the way that she engaged with that population, and then that's actually where she met my dad or my stepdad, and he was doing street outreach. So actually working with people who were unhoused and living in the streets of New York and bringing them into the system. So I've got it from both sides, and spent a lot of, as I said, my childhood and adolescent years in residential housing facilities for the formerly homeless, mentally ill, as well as for folks living with HIV/AIDS and in need of supportive housing. I think it just was a way in which I didn't even realize just demonstrated the humanity of everyone, and how no matter what walk of life or what privilege you think you're coming from, that there are circumstances that can be out of your control, and the need to show compassion and empathy. And that's something that I always say that I'm very lucky to have parents who are much better people and much better humans than I am. Just kind of live up to their example. But as part of that, and seeing how much it took to really pour so much into people who had a lot of needs, I kind of committed that I would never do that kind of work. I would certainly never do social work. And the joke's on me because now I run a residential program. It's a very different population.
I'm never. Oh, I am.
I knew that I had an interest in international issues. Obviously, my family being from outside of the U.S., so international development was an interest. I thought it was going to be more of a policy wonk. But yeah, in some ways, it is a full circle, life circle to be in this role. Again, I can't claim to have the level of impact that social workers do. It's really truly God's work that they're doing. And I don't know that I'm not a good enough person to do that kind of work, but it is, the focus on social impact is certainly something that I've been exposed to since the very beginning.
And I think you do yourself a disservice, but it is natural. My father and the work he did, even my mum, the work, you always look and go, wow, I would never have had the patience. I would never have had. But actually, it's amazing how much we absorb of their lives and their attitudes in terms of how we bring ourselves to that. Fascinating. So tell me about the strategy to execution piece, because when you were talking about the PhD and the ideas bit, for me, I'm a full-hearted believer. I've got so many ideas, but actually getting them to any sort of final product is always an issue. What was your experience there? Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, I think my experience was working with folks who, again, really had, we're looking at the evidence, we're coming up with really interesting solutions, and thought that was the most critical part. And in many ways, that is a critical part, coming up with solutions, looking at the evidence, and coming up with the big ideas is super important. But I saw an undervaluing, particularly in academia, of how you actualize those big ideas in the real world, whether we're doing, thinking about a new solution for community healthcare in rural India, or a new solution for economic development in a community in sub-Saharan Africa. There are a lot of nuts and bolts and ways that what you envision sitting in New York City as a great solution just it's not going to turn out the way you hope for it to turn out in those markets for all sorts of reasons. And it's something that in hindsight, I realize in the private sector, because you have more of that rapid feedback loop. You constantly are testing, right? And actually seeing what's happening in real time. And if you don't do that, you don't exist anymore. We don't have that in academia, and particularly in some of the bigger nonprofit institutions. You can run down a path for 5 years and realize, oh, wow, this is actually isn't working in the real world. And you can do that without necessarily having the same level of feedback and accountability that you would have to if you were doing this for profit, which also kind of led me towards this idea of how to explore what I was thinking of as more sustainable models that had more of that direct feedback loop. I don't want to make that sound like I do not believe in public or philanthropic investment. I am not one of these people who will tell you that the private sector is going to be the solve for every social issue. In fact, I think the role of government and the NGO or nonprofit sector is really important in many of these public goods conversations. But I did want to be able to leverage more of that learning from the private sector to realize some of these grand visions.
For me, it's the same for design thinking. What we're talking about here is feedback loops, MVPs, minimum viable products, prototyping, experimenting, testing. And a lot of that is organizations who have profit and have funding enables you to do that. So a lot of what you're doing now in Halcyon House is about enabling, incubating some of those ideas and working with that. So tell us a bit about Halcyon House, because it's got an interesting background, and there's little things about what houses, what buildings you're working in that I was fascinated about.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So Halcyon, as an organization, and that's what we're called, inherited our name from Halcyon House. Halcyon House is a historic property here in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., built for the first Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Studdard. Should acknowledge, who built this building, who built many buildings in this area in Washington, D.C. It was built by slaves for this admiral at the start of the American experiment. And so we've got a storied history, just starting from that genesis, right? Through many, many iterations. We were lucky enough to have a co-founder, Dr. Sachiko Kuno, who purchased this property and really wanted to create an inspirational space for other founders. She's an amazing founder in her own right. After exiting her company, wanted to give back in this way. And we believe she was successful in certainly creating an inspirational space. You or any of your listeners are in Washington, D.C., would love to give you a tour because it is pretty fantastic. And where we started out was in 2014, was actually bringing entrepreneurs from across the world to live and work here. That's our residential program where we got our start. And yes, our founders actually do live in the house in this incredible space for 14 weeks, getting access to a variety of supports that kind of focus in around 4 areas. Getting the business fundamentals. We all know that the nuts and bolts that businesses need to work out. Figuring out investment readiness and really taking a broad approach to that. That is looking at the variety of financing options and tools that might be available to our entrepreneurs to support the scale of their ventures and their impact. Impact, and most importantly, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we are focused on impact-driven startups. So that's how you define, measure, and tell stories about impact, because all 3 of those are really important. And finally, leadership. And that is a big emphasis for us. Thinking about that journey from founder to CEO. In our residential program, each of our fellows, as we call them, are paired with leadership coaches so they can actually work through some of these issues. Many of them are thinking about how they're growing their team, what's the kind of culture they're trying to set up. And increasingly, we're thinking about governance and ethics. We cannot assume by just having a social mission that means that all of the governance and ethics things are going to be taken care of. We've had some unfortunate examples of why we can't make those assumptions. I'm sure you've watched the Theranos documentaries and series. Same thing with WeWork and WeCrashed. We've had some pretty clear examples that just having a nice mission is not enough. So all of those things are really important. And then what kind of undergirds all of that is a community that we build among our fellows. And I'm actually not a founder, right? So I can bring resources, I can corral support, But in terms of understanding the day-to-day of what's happening, it's really that community of a network of founders together that's able to support each other and to be frank and honest about what they're doing. So that's the core of the program that I run. I should mention that for our incubator, for any of our programs, we don't take equity, which we think is really important. And we are serving many underserved founders, and this is going to be critical to their own wealth generation in addition to the impact they're going to have, and don't take equity at this stage. We do, developing out of this residential program, have developed other programs. So recognize that everyone can come to Washington, D.C. for 14 weeks to live and work here. And I should have mentioned that our residential program is industry agnostic, region agnostic. Folks can truly come from anywhere as long as impact, whether that's social or environmental, is at the core of the revenue model. We've developed what we call intensives, which are shorter programs and are differentiated in that they're more focused around a specific issue area, a specific demographic, and or region. So for instance, this year we'll be running intensives, one focused on climate resilience in Latin America and the Caribbean, another focused on ag and food tech across Africa, really thinking about how you can leverage technology to address some of the food insecurity challenges. Another program for tech-enabled organizations from the Middle East and North Africa. And the last one is actually focused on entrepreneurs from the greater Washington area who are from and are serving historically disadvantaged communities. So you see that each one of those takes on a different focus, and so we build the program around them. And then finally, recognizing the needs that we saw from our founders, develops 3 investment vehicles to really close some of the gaps that we were seeing at this very early stage. We're looking at pre-seed and seed ventures. So we've got the Halcyon Fund, which is a $5 million fund, which invests exclusively in ventures that have come through Halcyon or any of our programs. We've got our Halcyon Angels, a group of accredited angel investors who invest in Halcyon Ventures, as well as other impact-driven ventures that are sourced by a team. And finally, a microloan fund. And that fund is for our US-based ventures, really giving them access to that friends and family round that many don't have access to, closing that gap. And because we have de-risked them, we're not taking collateral, we're not looking at credit scores. We understand these founders really well. So kind of these different financing mechanisms allow us to support our fellows in our ventures.
So much we could talk about, and I'm fascinated by a couple of areas, particularly that I go into here. So one is the business fundamentals, but what you're doing is you're bringing together so many different cultures, backgrounds, just those groups. I'm interested in terms of the almost the international blend and how that plays out in some of the stories that come out about how you coach and work in there. Yeah. You started off, as I understand, that you would bring 12 people from Saudi Arabia together, and then there's a real mix of different cultures, different processes and backgrounds into this. I'm fascinated about how that affects the business fundamentals and cultures of those organizations.
I mean, and everything's super contextualized, right? And the program that we in the residential program, and this remains to date, really brings anyone from anywhere. So the next cohort, which begins in just a couple of weeks, we'll have folks from 8 ventures from 8 different countries. And so we do understand that business fundamentals are different in terms of the various contexts where folks are based. What we try to build in are some of the elements that are common. Financial modeling, everyone's going to have to do that. Maybe you'll have some different accounting standards based on your jurisdiction, but that's going to be relatively similar. Similarly, thinking about the cores of how you're going to build teams. We understand there'll be nuances in employment law, but there'll still be some core characteristics. And then also when we think about customer discovery and sort of the key elements and how you get to know your customer and develop that product market fit, there are some key tactics that we know that we can leverage. for each of those. So that's how we incorporate it and try to find what the common denominator is. And then for those things that are more nuanced and context-based, try to build support around the founders that gives them some more of that direct subject matter expertise. So whether that's connecting with a mentor who's going to provide that one-on-one support, an advisor who may come in and just drop in for office hours and give some feedback. Those are the kinds of things that we do to be more specific when we need to.
And as a design thinker and an entrepreneur, I'm going, wow, the insights that you must derive going in there. It's one of those ones where you could want to dive into that to explore. So it must be fascinating. But also just thinking where design thinking and product design is going, it's about the extreme users, and you're gathering extreme users together in a lot of ways to work that up. So yeah. I want to pick up on the impact as well, because defining impact, we're going through ESG at the moment, and we're thinking about becoming a B corporation. And again, it's this piece about how you talk about being at the core of your business model and how you differentiate that. So tell me a few examples, maybe just to help the listeners understand what you mean by that. Yeah.
Where we start out is really talking about their theory of change, right? Which is not a new concept. It's actually a pretty traditional model, but I find it is actually really helpful to have founders really clearly articulate in a succinct way what's the problem that they're trying to solve, in what context, the activities that they're doing to solve that, their expected outputs, outcomes, and that vision, right? And the most important part of that exercise is that underneath each of those areas and the connective tissue between them are assumptions. And laying out what those assumptions are is really critical, and helping people define what their impact is, and are they making the right and informed logical leaps there. One of the examples that I often use, sort of at the start of talking about impact measurement and why it's so necessary, is that when we started off with along the journey of digital money, for instance, and I say this because I spent the last few years very much focused on financial inclusion. It was an assumption that all digital money it's always a good thing, and by and large, digital money has been a good thing, and financial inclusion has been a good thing. But I have a good friend, Evelyn Stark, who I've often heard her say that in order to get access to something like a payday loan, or to online gambling, or to predatory debt, you have to be financially included, right? That's what we're building on top of financial inclusion. So if you do that without, particularly looking at a credit product, without appropriately giving the information at the right time to folks so that they understand what they're getting into, what the repayment is like, and what the consequences are like of not repaying, then you could be in a circumstance where your goal of offering credit to maybe a smallholder farmer or a small shopkeeper in a developing city, could actually be something very judgmental or harmful. We see that as the case in Kenya, where folks were getting access to credit, and even for small dollar amounts, not fully recognizing what the pay schedules are like or what the ramifications of not repaying back, and being blacklisted for having a $1 or $2 balance, right? Which is not the consequence that we want of financial inclusion. So it's really about laying those things out. And then, it's not that theory of change is going to stay static. It's similar to what we were just discussing. It's going to be something that's iterated on, right? And those assumptions are going to constantly be tested and changed, so that you understand what the impact is that you're having, and continue to use that as your North Star.
Love that. So it's almost Lafley's play to win concept. What needs to be true, the assumptions piece, what needs to be true for this to be successful? So testing out early on the assumptions is what you're doing. Yeah.
We have a whole other section on play to win. As a former Deloitte consultant, it was actually a framework we used quite a bit.
I love it. No, we've been using it. We absolutely. I mean, part of it is getting your head around. And I think this is what I love about what you're doing, is you're getting people together to share, iterate, and presumably they share their business stories across this group as well. So they've got multiple different variations, and that's part of getting your head around it is incredible. I want to just pick up on just another area you talked about, which is leadership in there, because again, leadership in a social impact inclusion way it's almost you're holding yourselves to some higher benchmarks than you would in other organizations. So how do you operate and work in that space? It'd be fascinating to hear.
Yeah, so there are multiple facets that we pull. As I mentioned, we have leadership coaches, which I think are really critical. They're all certified leadership coaches who work with our fellows directly, which is a fantastic resource that we have. We give them a little bit of a framework, but really allow them to address the issues that they want to tackle directly with their coach. What's always interesting about that is you have at least one or two in any cohort who's like, I don't really believe in that. I don't really need that. And more often than not, folks come out really valuing that experience. Yeah. Sometimes people aren't ready for leadership coaching, and leadership coaching is not therapy, but I think there are some analogies. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing, right? If you have to, there has to be some level of self-reflection in order for therapy to be useful. I think same thing with leadership coaching. So that's one mechanism. We also have a few sessions where we focus in on leadership coaching, sort of more of our skill series approach. One led by Kate Goodall, our CEO and co-founder, really thinking about, as you are building the culture of your organization, what is that culture that you want to have, and how do you embed it? What are the rituals that you create? How do you embed that in hiring, onboarding, and offboarding? Right? There's all of those things. These founders are really lucky in that they get to choose. Right? They are determining what the culture is going to be. It's their venture, and theirs really to make that decision. Obviously, there should be some participatory elements to it, yeah. But at the end of the day, they are the leaders, and that's, I think, really, really great, but also daunting, particularly as they think about growth. And then there's another element that we do, which is peer case consultations. So really, again, leveraging the community. The founders come, we give them a methodology, how you actually work through this hour and a half with your peers, but one of the fellows comes with a challenge, and they're really leveraging the collective intelligence of the group. And often those challenges are the people-related challenges, right? We know who to go to if we've got a challenge on a particular element of the technology that we're trying to build, or a particular element of design. There are specialists in that. We are less often giving people the tools from a people leadership perspective and to know where to go there. So using that collective intelligence of the community of their fellow fellows, as we say, is something that has been really powerful in answering questions like, how do you have a flexible culture where you have both accountability, but also not the rigidity that you see in many corporate environments. How do you honestly learn to let go, which I think is one of the hardest parts on that founder to CEO journey for the entrepreneurs that we support, because when you have built everything from the ground up and been part of every decision, letting go, and it is a blessing to be able to be in the position to hire, but it's also a challenge, I think, for many folks to learn how to make that transition. So those peer case consultations are another way that we get folks engaged. So we've got kind of those elements. And increasingly, we've been thinking about governance. And most recently, I've been very lucky to work with David Porteous and his new venture at Enthralled as they're coming up with new frameworks and how early stage companies should be thinking about governance. We've been able to leverage some of the learnings that they've developed in the most recent cohorts, which has been really fantastic. And it's an evolving conversation, right? We've seen whole companies get billions of dollars and not have a real board, right? With an external board member. FTX is a great example of a failure of governance, and a failure. There's so many failures. We could spend a whole podcast talking about that.
Always on failures. Well, failure is a good thing, but it depends on the scale and the impact.
that governance piece is something that I'm curious and interested to dive a little bit more into. It's something that when you're running a program like this, you have to balance out is what do you provide that is in demand, right? And I would say at the top of that list, everyone wants to talk about investment. Everyone wants to talk about how to get money. Completely understand that is the biggest bottleneck for early stage ventures. it's a little less sexy to talk about what your governance structure is, and particularly for a founder who's just out there trying to build, they don't really want to think about like, oh, that sounds like bureaucracy, and so how do you balance that with like giving folks something that we know will be of service in the long term, but maybe isn't the sexiest thing in the moment, and how do you frame it in the right way and calibrate it so it's actually relevant, right? Talking about a full-fledged board and lots of policies, procedures, and Robert's rules, like that doesn't make sense, for somebody who's a year into or two into their venture, but there's still governance considerations for them to have, particularly as they fundraise and think about bringing on new folks into. So that's one of the areas where I'm really curious to do a deeper dive on and see how our curricula evolves in that area.
I love that. And also probably massive learnings for just generally outside into the world about how we do governance by having that hothouse and the incubator to learn. So it links to a question I've got in my head, which is about how you measure all of this, how you measure and how do you track people have gone through. So when were you founded? How many years have you been going now?
So it'll be 9 years this year. So 2014. So we're on the cusp of our 10-year anniversary. We track metrics that I think are similar to many other incubators, accelerators in this space. We look at the survivability rate of our companies. We look at how much they've raised, how much revenue that they've been able to make. We also look at how many lives they've impacted, because we've got so much diversity in the kinds of companies that we support. We ask the founders to define, again, how they're measuring that impact, and then rely on them to provide those numbers. And so those are the core metrics. And for us, it's also key to track who we're supporting. Right? We are really proud of the fact that over 70% of the companies that Halcyon has supported are founded or co-founded by women, and also over 70% are founded or co-founded by people of color. That is, critical. We know that those communities have viable solutions and often more capital efficient solutions, and just are not. And everyone has seen the statistics that are abysmal in VC in terms of how much capital is going to women-led companies and to communities of color. We're very proud of really flipping that on its head and almost having the inverse of those numbers in many ways.
You should be massively proud of that, Dan. I could talk and probably I've got listeners who are going, "Why didn't you ask this question on this?" as we go through. So, when we get to it, I'd love to ask where people can find out more about this. But before I do that, I want to end with 3 questions, and it'd be interesting for me just thinking about your humility, about your parents, stepdad, and mom, and how you are in this, just what you've learned and what you've picked up in these. So the first question is, what's the one small memorable moment that shaped your leadership career?
Yeah, there's so many. But when you ask this question, one that really jumped to mind is an example from when I was an undergrad and actually an RA. And it's fascinating how much leadership skills I learned as an RA, but I had a really fantastic mentor and boss at the time, Daniel, who also named Daniel. All the best leaders are named Daniel.
All the best leaders.
Watched him actually go through a really difficult sort of just personal situation, and seeing how he was still able to lead a team, being authentic, but also still demonstrating leadership while dealing with something so personal. I just really reflect on sort of that example of leadership and sort of that balance that he was able to bring to that situation, and something that I think remains my back of my mind when things are, when all the shit is hitting the fan, so to speak. How do you still maintain leadership in those circumstances?
Yeah, there's a real integrity there, isn't there? There's a transparency, there's humility, and there's a vulnerability around that, and then keeping yourself stable and working there. I love that example. So the second question is, if you had one thing you could disrupt in leaders today, what would it be?
Yeah, I think, and this is maybe particular to the space that I'm in. I actually don't think that's actually it's true across leadership. The ego-driven nature of so much leadership, and I know we all have egos. Right? That's not to say to get rid of ego, but that being at the center of how folks lead can be so damaging, and I've seen actually great examples of the opposite. In my time at Mastercard, from Ajay Banga on down to working with folks like Nicole Lindsay and Marla Blow, really demonstrating what it's like to lead with service in mind, and service to your team, service to the folks that you're trying to support. That version of leadership, if we could have more of those examples, I think that would really disrupt the norms that we have and how people lead.
I've always said I don't have a tattoo, but I've always said if I had one tattoo from the Stoics, it would be Ryan Holiday's "Ego is the enemy," because I do strongly believe I love that you picked that one in there. So I love that. Final question: one leadership habit that's non-negotiable for you. What would it be? One habit.
It's something that's very, I think, tied to what I just said. Is the thing that I always tell my teams is that I wanted us to take our work seriously, but not to take ourselves seriously. So the habit that I try to implement is just honestly kind of laughing at myself routinely, and using that as a way to pull down some of the ego. And sometimes my team takes that a little bit too far and also laughing at me. But I'm really open to that, because I think that is something that we just be in any position of power or authority, it can very easy to go down this path of being so serious and kind of believing in your own in the authority that's given to you, really as a privilege, but it can be something that turns the other way. So that ability to laugh at yourself and have that kind of community throughout the team is something that is a habit that's non-negotiable for me.
Amazing. Love that. Laugh at yourself. Strong believer in that. And with our British humor, that's an important part, because we've laughed at ourselves for years. So, it's a good thing. Amazing. Dan, huge pleasure to have you on today. If people want to know more about Halcyon and the work, where would they find you?
So we are at halcyonhouse.org. And Halcyon is HALCYON, and it's going to be a difficult one for people to spell. And also Halcyon Inspires on Twitter, and I am D. Jason Barker on Twitter.
Amazing. Dan, I'm desperate to come and take you up on that tour around and see the Halcyon and the work you do, but appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, and I'm sure many people will want to know more and dig in with you on that. So lovely to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much.
Well, folks, that was Dan Barker. Dan, amazing episodes, amazing learnings. I loved his answers to the questions coming up the end, particularly, the ego piece around disrupting leaders, and I'm a strong believer in that. But also just the memorable moment about, when you're going through tough times and how a leader can inspire to provide that balance and care for everybody else, even though they're going through the tough time. Halcyon, amazing organization. The people we work with are working in there and supporting them. And again, the founders seem to have done some amazing work to transform it. But I love the background and the story and how the red thread through that organization is something that is making demonstrable change in terms of whether it's women or people of color in terms of owning those businesses. So I'm working successfully. Love that. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please leave a rating, a review for the podcast. The ratings and reviews are very much about how we drive the message of Dan and the likes of those people who turn up on this podcast to do that. So I'd love you to do that. And I look forward to welcoming you in another episode of the Leadership Tales podcast very shortly.